Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this 10th EO Talk. We've made it to a 10th talk today. We are really pleased, Rachel, Usama, and myself, to host Dr. LIAT NAEH, who's going to talk to us about archaeological display and omission in 1936 Palestine. Allow me to introduce Dr. NAEH first. Dr. NAEH is a scholar and a museum professional focusing on the art and archaeology of the ancient Middle East during the Bronze and Iron Ages. She is particularly interested in Levantine artistic practices and ideology in an age of global exchange with the Mediterranean, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Dr. NAEH has published extensively on Levantine bone and ivory carving and ritualistic furniture, and she's the co-editor of a recent volume on thrones in the ancient world. She's currently researching early 20th century displays of biblical archaeology within museum exhibitions in Israel and beyond. So this is really the work she's gonna showcase today. Prior to joining us here in Toronto at the Archaeology Center, where she's a research associate, Dr. NAEH was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York and at the Bard Graduate Center, also in New York. In 2018, Dr. NAEH graduated from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where her PhD dissertation titled Local Art in the Southern Levant, Middle Bronze Age Bone Inlaid Boxes of the Geometric Family, analyzed unique bone inlaid boxes found in Southern Levantine elite tombs during the Middle Bronze Age as a case study for Egyptian Levantine cultural connections and the development of Levantine art. During her PhD studies, she's been a visiting scholar at Columbia University in New York and also at the Fribourg University in Switzerland. In 2017, her paper, In Search for Identity, which revisits Iron Age Levantine ivories, has won the Sean W. Dever Memorial Prize for Best Student Paper in the field of Syro-Palestinian or Biblical Archaeology. Before that, her MA thesis, which examined the use and manufacture of miniature vessels and 7-cup bowls in the Middle Bronze Age cult site of Nahariya in Israel, was awarded the Polonsky Prize. So it's really, once again, a pleasure to host you, LIAT, today. I will just remind our audience to keep your mics and camera off, but I guess most of you know this by now, and you are welcome to type in any question you have for LIAT in the chat box, starting from, we're asking you to wait till the end of our talk to do so, so that it's not too disruptive for the flow of our paper. And with that, I'm passing the mic to you, LIAT.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Blois. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Thank you for having me here. And also thank you to Dr. Aligad and Myers for hosting together this program. I've been following your talks and I love the content, and I'm very, very pleased and happy to be here today. Thank you for having me. So, today I would like to explore an archaeological exhibition held at the Agricultural School of Mikveh Israel in what was then Palestine in January 1936. The exhibition, held for a mere week, was curated by an archaeologist by the name of Judith Krause-Marquet. At the time, the British governed both the Arab and the Jewish people living in the land. The NAEH exhibition featured the results of her 3 excavation season at this site, known by its Arabic name Atel, now in Palestine in the West Bank between Jericho and Ramallah. Since the 19th century, the site was commonly identified as the biblical city Ha'ai. Krause's excavation was initiated and funded by Baron Edmund de Rothschild, who was one of the chief supporters and financiers of the Zionist settlement movement. While this exhibition was only open for about a week and was hardly documented at the time, And while it was in the past 80 so years, it was utterly forgotten, I will argue that the Ha'ai exhibition offers us remarkable insight into the inherent conflicts of displaying archaeological finds within a biblical context. With no trace of an exhibition catalog, today I would like to discuss the exhibition in its historic setting and the reception of the exhibition. Basing mostly on letters from the archives of the Israel Antiquities Authority and the Hebrew University, as well as Hebrew journals, I will argue that this 1936 archaeological exhibition dealt with some surprisingly contemporary issues. In the rare media footage from the opening day, sometime in January 1936, we see robe-wearing Christian priests from the French School of Bible and Archaeology in Jerusalem, the École Biblique, arriving to the agricultural school of Mikveh Israel east of Jaffa. Established at the end of the 19th century, this agricultural school was and is a well-known Jewish institute where generations of students were trained as farmers. And now I'm showing the film, so if you can't see it well, please see it later on the YouTube link that I shared on the chat. The High Commissioner of the British Mandate Administration, Arthur Walkup, seen to the right, is accompanied by Eliyahu Krause, head of the school, to the left. Judith Krause-Marquet, the excavator and curator, was Eliyahu Krause's daughter. Her father was Rothschild's employee, and it was through this connection that she received the excavation project from Rothschild. As far as we can gather, the exhibition told the story of the two phases of this site: the early Iron Age city, built on top the ruins of the early Bronze Age city. The exhibition was held indoors in Mikveh Israel, which is about an hour-and-a-half drive from the site in the Muslim Palestinian village of Dir Dibwan. Because of the distance from the Tel, the walls of the exhibition were adorned by photos of the Tel and its landscape. Labels in Hebrew and English accompanied each find. Field footage incorporated in the newsreel, I'm just waiting for that to show up. Okay. So field footage incorporated in the newsreel featured a monumental early Bronze Age building, possibly a palace. Finally, we see the excavator and curator, Judith Krause-Marquet, who died of tuberculosis just a few months later. The early Bronze Age city of Atil, or Ha'ai, was protected by a stone wall. In addition to the possible Acropolis Palace, Krause identified a multi-phase shrine near the wall, abundant with pottery vessels, including the two so-called incense burners, ivory and bone inlaid handles, animal bones, and vessels of Egyptian alabaster. Tombs yielded rich evidence of burial rituals, including a burial of a child within a bowl, which was featured in the exhibition. After a considerable chronological gap at Atel or Ha'ai, came a much smaller early Iron Age city, which also yielded some unique objects of cult, such as the complete stand or incense burner with multiple windows and anthropomorphic-looking feet, which was put in the center of the exhibition hall. In the Bible, the story of Ha'ai serves as a turning point in the Israelite conquer of the land and is rendered with exceptional detail. After successfully making the walls of Jericho fall using only the sound of Israelite trumpets, Joshua is troubled by failing to conquer Ha'ai. Having then stoned an Israelite that sinned, Joshua's second attempt to conquer Ha'ai is triumphant. God allows Joshua to make Ha'ai into a ruin, as its Hebrew and Arabic name suggests, thus opening the path for the Israelite to take over the land of the Canaanites. The biblical story of Ha'ai must have been on the mind of all visitors to the exhibition. To both Jewish and Christian people, the exhibition showcased remains that seem to have been taken straight out of the pages of the Bible. Indeed, years before, Rothschild sought an excavation location that would trace Joshua's conquest of Canaan. Through an unlikely sequence of events, he ended up hiring the 25-year-old daughter of his employee, Judith Krause, who was the one to have chosen this site. In a speech delivered at the grand opening, Father Vincent of the French École Biblique framed the exhibition as a scientific feat, and at the same time stressed its contribution for the authentication of the Bible. I must convey special appreciation to Mrs. Krause-Marquet's exhibition. One needs only glimpse these finds in order to value their great importance. Whoever questioned the truth and the stories about the Canaanites, the Amalekites, Abraham, Joshua, must come here to see for their own eyes that these people existed in history. While this may seem as a somewhat fanciful view of an exhibition composed mostly of early Bronze Age and Iron Age pottery vessels, for the audience, the exhibits themselves were marginal. It was their illustration of the Bible that was showcased. Dr. Eliezer Sukenik, head of the new Department of Archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was established only a decade earlier, also illuminated the exhibition's Zionist aims. There is more to this exhibition than archaeology. Baron Rothschild, the father of the new settlement, realized that the past cannot be neglected. And this sentiment was reiterated by none other than the High Commissioner of the British administration in Palestine, Wakop, who spoke of Rothschild's original vision of learning more of this land being a battlefield of the conquering armies of Israelites. In that, Wakop evoked the contemporary rivalry between the Jewish and Arab-Palestinian people about this very same land. Rothschild's portrait, mounted on the wall of the exhibition, was imagined by one Jewish columnist to be that of a conqueror who wanted to discover the ways of a previous conqueror who passed through Ai. This sentiment was repeated in numerous newspaper articles, revealing that Jewish visitors who came to the exhibition were deeply moved. The symbolism of this exhibition location was clear to the Jewish audience. As one reporter commented, "I see here a handsome chain of links, connecting the past with the future. I past, Mikveh Israel present, with an aim for the future." At Mikveh Israel, the Bible was set against the backdrop of renewed Jewish-led agriculture, evoking claim over this land. Some visitors even thought that a round stone displayed in the exhibition was not unlike the stone David used to topple Goliath. At this point, you may wonder if the excavator and curator, Judith Krause-Marquet, also voiced such views. Interestingly, all records show that for her, the cultures of the early Bronze and Iron Ages had value independent of their biblical or Jewish legacy. Krause is oftentimes described as a first. She was the first Jewish archaeologist born in Ottoman Palestine to head a major biblically oriented archaeological excavation in the Holy Land. Moreover, she was the first Jewish archaeologist to be born in Palestine, and she was also the first female Jewish archaeologist. She was part of a generation of children born at the Holy Land who embodied the hopes of the Jewish newcomers, and her interest in archaeology was certainly a reflection of that social calling. Yet it is also Yet it was also a profoundly novel and risky pursuit. For at the time, the few active Jewish archaeologists in the Holy Land focused their efforts on excavating ancient synagogues, which could not or would not criticize the biblical narrative. Krause was thus exceptional in her interest in Bronze and Iron Ages archaeology, the supposed time of the Canaanites and the Israelites of the Bible. By excavating Bronze and Iron Age strata, she was the first local Jewish scholar to risk unearthing archaeological evidence that would openly engage with the historicity of the Bible. Krause was born in either 1904 or 1906 to parents Eliyahu Krause and Chaya NAEH. Her place of birth and early childhood was a landmark of the Zionist settlement movement, Sedgera, an agricultural farm in the Lower Galilee. Her extended family included dozens of the most dominant, well-known leaders of the early Jewish settlement movement. From Mikveh Israel, again headed by her father, From Sedgera, her family moved to yet another landmark of the movement, the Agricultural School of Mikveh Israel, again headed by her father, Eliyahu Krause, and funded by Rothschild. At the age of 16, around 1920, Krause was sent to Paris to study French in order to return to Palestine as an instructor of the French language, which was a respectable profession for a woman of her status and would help her serve the Jewish settlement by the education of children. However, for unknown reasons, her time in Paris shifted her academic interests, and she became a scholar of the art and archaeology of the ancient Near East. At the age of 26, Krause returned to Palestine and became an archaeologist at Galstang's excavation at Jericho. While it was often assumed that she returned to Palestine for ideological reasons, she was, in fact, urgently called home after her brother died while they were both in Paris in 1931. We should also consider that by that time, her Zionist identity may have been compromised in the eyes of her family and community. For while in Paris, she met a Christian, a Gentile French aristocrat named Yves Marquet, who she would later marry and who became a prominent scholar of Islamic philosophy. It seems that after that, she only visited Palestine during the excavation, but spent the majority of the year in the couple's Parisian apartment right off Luxembourg Gardens, and seen here on the address left on her business card. And at the Marquet's family ancient chateau in northwestern France, as seen here to the right. This is a dramatic change from her own pioneer background. Rothschild's vision of the excavation was indeed a Zionist one, and the exhibition location, Mikveh Israel, was more than merely Krause's childhood home. It was one of the most dominant pre-state Zionist institutions. But there is evidence suggesting Krause was not intent on framing her archaeological work in a Zionist context. After Rothschild's death in November 1934, she allied with the Louvre Museum in Paris, planning for 3 more seasons of excavations at Ha'ai. Under the Louvre, her work would not have been considered Zionist at all. So far, I've presented the reception of the exhibition within Jewish and Christian audiences, deeply moved with what they saw as the Bible coming to life. I have also discussed how such biblical associations were intimately related to Zionism in Palestine, though I made a point of noting Krause's seemingly nuanced approach to the place of Zionism in her own work. Now I would like to further problematize Krause's curatorial point of view. How could visitors thought that the exhibition was bringing the Bible to life when Krause's excavation famously debunked the biblical myth of Ha'ai? According to her excavations, the site of Ha'ai must have already been abandoned long before Joshua could have set eyes on it. If we were to correlate the Bible with archaeological periods, we would assume that the biblical Israelites surveilled around Canaan and what would be the late Bronze Age, conquer it and settle it during the early Iron Age. Yet according to Krause's excavation, Ha'ai was abandoned at the end of the early Bronze Age, anytime between 2400 or 2200 BCE. And so by the time the Israelites arrived, nearly 1,000 years later, it would not have been occupied at all, leaving them with nothing to conquer. The irony of Krause's excavation conclusion is overwhelming, considering that the excavation was explicitly initiated in order to find evidence for Joshua's conquest. Rothschild, who fostered a keen interest in biblical archaeology in the Holy Land and had already financed an excavation in Jerusalem in the city of David, was looking for an excavation site that would verify the biblical narrative of the conquest of the land. By the year 1935, Krause had already published several interim reports aimed for the academic public in both French and Hebrew, where she laid out the tenets of her biblical criticism. But when writing in Hebrew newspaper to the wider public, she described the results of her third season of excavation at Ha'ai without acknowledging how they questioned the biblical narrative. I therefore argue that there was a deep discrepancy between how she portrayed the finds of Ha'ai to the academic community and how she presented to the layman audience. And I wonder if she omitted her criticism of the Bible from the exhibition as well. Without learning of Krause's criticism of the Bible, Jewish and Christian visitors were left free to experience the exhibition as a transcendental event, transporting them into biblical times and proving the Bible's historic value. Rothschild himself died before the exhibition took place, but archival materials revealed that he was deeply invested in the question of how to display his archaeological finds in a way that would honor their biblical context. Long before the excavation site was selected, before the pick ever hit the ground, Rothschild was already negotiating with the British government on how to display the finds. In 1932, the High Commissioner of Palestine, Wakab, urged the Director of Antiquities for the Mandate Government of Palestine, Ernest Richmond, to go against the British antiquities law in Palestine and to allow Rothschild to have individual possession of whatever archaeological finds he will unearth in order to display them within Jewish institutions and supervise their showcasing. The British Mandate Antiquity Law was meant to monitor all excavations in the Holy Land and require that all finds be first sent to the newly established Palestine Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, now known as the Rockefeller Museum, where the British Department of Antiquities would select finds to be included in their galleries before allowing the excavator to distribute the remaining finds. The Rockefeller Museum was meant to be impartial to religious or ethnic affiliations, and this was at odds with Rothschild's wish of presenting whatever evidence he will find of Joshua as Jewish history. Richmond specified that for Rothschild, a condition for his undertaking this work was that he should be allowed to acquire all the Jewish objects that might be found and dispose of them among institutions in Palestine as he sees fit. He was prepared to agree that the government museum might have all the non-Jewish objects, whether Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, or other. It was Richmond's understanding that Rothschild mostly meant to keep cult objects used in worship according to the Mosaic law and belonging to the period in which the Baron is interested. While Richmond was confident that this request contradicted the spirit of the law, by which the Rockefeller Museum should have all archaeological finds of importance to the history of Palestine, he was inclined to indicate that an arrangement will be possible. This correspondence sheds light on the meaning of the subsequent 1936 exhibitions of the finds from Ha'ai. Even prior to the excavation, the issue of the display of the finds was matter of international diplomacy, and their presentation as Jewish history was prioritized over British law. This promise of favoritism leads me to the subject of the tensions between the Jewish and Arab people in Palestine during the time of the excavation, and how these were reflected within the exhibition. I have mentioned that the exhibition featured labels in Hebrew and English, but not Arabic. We have almost no record of Arab visiting the exhibition, although it should be noted that Mikveh Israel hosted Arab students frequently. Yet it is illuminating to read the words of one Jewish columnist who described how a single Arab visitor stumbled into the exhibition. I translate. An Arab chauffeur of one of the British officials who, as he was dragging his feet following his master into the exhibition hall, opened wide-eyed and stretched his arms in bafflement. Haven't these people seen a broken vase before? According to the Jewish reporter, the Arab visitor could not fathom the importance of the exhibition, perhaps because he does not imagine that these broken vases representing the Bible coming to life. This idea that the true meaning of the exhibition cannot be understood by an Arab visitor, that an Arab does not belong in the exhibition, is derogatory. But it also erases the ongoing crucial contribution of Arab-Palestinians to the excavation. The excavation took place on Arab-Palestinian land, at the site that was known by its Arab name, Etel. It was de facto excavated by Arabs, 150 local workers who came from several cities, including Ramallah, Beit-In, and Jericho. They remain nameless. Several of Krause's eulogy go into detail of how adored she was by her Arab workmen, and how, while it was they who performed the manual labor of digging, they were not conscious of the meaning of their work. According to a family friend of the Krauses, the Arab workers would tell of the Hebraic maiden who walks among us, fair-haired and blue-eyed, who speaks our language and commands many people with a smile and with ease rather than a whip. And much wonder to behold, the workers adhered to her willingly and performed their duty with love and devotion. Wherever direction the trowel faced, she found what she was looking for because God was with her. According to Father Van San of the École Biblique, Mrs. Judith Krause was an Eretz Israelienne with all her gentle soul and sharp mind. With one word, an energetic glance, and a heartfelt smile, she would encourage the workmen. It is of wonder to me that in an area that is all Muslim, working with 150 Muslim workmen, this young daughter of Israel was able to maintain order, discipline, and respect. Such description is, however, somewhat at odds with historic evidence. In the years the excavation took place between 1933 and 1935, there were growing tensions between Jews and Arabs in Palestine of the British Mandate. For instance, in October 1933, Arab-Palestinians protested against the British Mandate's acceptance of Jewish refugees from Germany, which doubled the Jewish population. Krause leased the land of the Tel from its Muslim Palestinian owners in Deir Dibwan. Here, in the photo to the left, taken in 1934, we see the leadership of the excavation staff outside of their rented excavation house in Deir Dibwan. Yet by October of that year, Krause wielded Rothschild's influence over the British administration to request the expropriation of the land from the till from its Arab-Palestinian legal owners against their explicit wishes. In her reasoning, she explained that Rothschild aimed for the archaeological site to be preserved as a historical monument, and complained that even the falach owners, the Arab farmers, who agreed to sell their share of the tel, asked for inflated prices, while others yet simply refused to sell altogether. It is possible that the seizing of the land was not finalized because of Rothschild's death. This was the undercurrent of the Arab-Jewish relationship in the field, and it led to her leaving the excavation house and moving the finds to Mikveh Israel, where the exhibition was eventually held. The exhibition took place in January 1936, and by April 1936 began an organized workers' strike of all Arab Palestinians in the country to protest Jewish settlement, which then became a deadly confrontation between the three sides, Arab, Jewish, and British. I argue that this conflict was very much present at the exhibition, though not declared. It was present in the displacement of the finds from Dir Dibwan and their installations in Mikveh Israel. In the absence of Arabs from the exhibition, the lack of labels in Arabic, and mostly in the way the exhibition was understood by Jewish visitors as an analogy to the biblical conquest of the land, when one city made way to a city of Israelite newcomers. Let us now revisit the exhibition footage with fresh eyes. We have discussed the reception of the exhibition by visitors who saw it as proving biblical narratives. We also have noted how such an interpretation strangely contrasted Krause's own conclusion from the field, who doubted the historical truth of the Bible. We do not yet have sufficient information to ascertain whether Krause's criticism was even mentioned in the exhibition. It was certainly not recalled by the visitors or by the journalists. We have discussed how Rothschild made sure the finds would be displayed as Jewish history before knowing what objects would be excavated. Could any Bronze and Iron Age finds have served just the same, evoking the same reactions by the visitors? For this reason, in this talk, I made a point of using the name I rather than only Atel to convey this attitude. We are left with unanswered questions about Krause's own curatorial approach. In light of little evidence we have, I would argue she attempted to deliver the results of the excavation in the highest possible scientific standard. At the time, Mikveh Israel housed numerous study collections of agricultural specimens, as well as local flora and fauna, arranged in very similar glass vitrines to encourage student engagement. The yield of the land was classified, preserved, and studied in what was deemed to be a modern, scientific, and westernized approach. The Ha'ai exhibition was like that, the so-called modern and progressive scientific harvest of the land. Krause's relationship with the Arab-Palestinian owners of the Tel is very much in the spirit of the times and in accordance with Jewish settlement practices. Yet her attitude towards the Bible is critical, and her intention was to continue working with the Louvre rather than the Hebrew University. In all of these nuanced attitudes and their inherent conflicts, I see the many complexities that would come to define Israeli biblical archaeology. The afterlife of the 1936 exhibition is no less complex. Following Krause's death, it seems that her family intended to keep the finds in order to establish a new archaeological museum, apparently in fulfillment of Rothschild's vision of displaying the finds as Jewish. Some of the most dominant finds were eventually sent to the Rockefeller Museum that opened in 1938 in accordance with British antiquities law, where they were displayed as part of an egalitarian representation of the myriad of cultures present in the archaeology of the land. Some of these Rockefeller finds were later incorporated in the permanent galleries of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, situated in vitrines dedicated to the early Bronze cult and early Iron Age cult, with key finds from Ha'ai presented as part of a greater haul of many sites. Back in the 1930s, Sukenik was also passionately negotiating to obtain the excavation finds from his nascent archaeological museum of Jewish antiquities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Having let go of the idea of creating their own museum of Jewish antiquities, the Krause family eventually sent many of Ha'ai finds to Sukenik of the Hebrew University, who dedicated a room in his museum in the memory of Krause, and the galleries inaugurated in 1941. Lastly, some finds of the excavation were also sent to the Louvre. Following Krause's death, the Louvre intended to continue the excavation with André Perrault, but that did not come to be. Under Jordanian rule, the site was excavated by Joseph Calloway and more recently by Khani Nur el-Din of Al-Quds University. Some of Krause's interpretations are now controversial, and the identification of the site with Ha'ai is in dispute. We are left to consider how from one initial temporary exhibition held in one hall in 1936 in Mikveh Israel, the distribution of the finds today reflects British, Palestinian, Israeli, Jordanian, and even French perceptions of ownership and archaeological interpretation. And I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. It was there was a lot of, there are a lot of intersecting questions, and I find myself very stimulated and grateful by your talk. So I'm inviting everyone in the virtual audience to type whatever question you may have for LIAT in the chat box, and I will allow myself to start with a question. So I'm actually really interested in the genesis of this project. This is something I'm always interested in when people present something. How did you come about working on this? And then, you know, knowing that you also have a kind of another life or another dimension to your scholarly work, how is Krause-Marquet really well known in Israel, or no? How did this project unfold for you?
So thank you. I'm very happy for this question, because it is I feel it's a very personal project for me, at least. Yes, Judith Krause-Marquet is well known in the sense that she is mentioned in undergrad curriculum. So in the first year of studying about the archaeology of Israel, I was told that Judith Krause-Marquet excavated at the site of Ha'ai, and that her finds there were sensational in the sense that they prove the biblical story to be not true. So this was sort of in my mind, and I later read more about her as I was interested in the work of a female archaeologist in our area in the Middle East. I'm also writing about one of her relatives who became an Assyriologist. So it's an interesting family story. But to really answer your question, I feel like by studying the early days of exhibiting archaeological finds in Israel and in Palestine, I feel like I'm able to raise some questions about how finds are presented today in a way that is perhaps easier to relate to. I feel like if we read these letters and the archives of the Israel Antiquities Authority, if we read, see these films, maybe it's easier for us in my community back in Israel for sure to acknowledge some of these themes that are still very much present in the way we present archaeology today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, earlier in our series, we had Morag Kersel's talk, right, about the Museum of the Bible, and there is a real conversation between your two talks. And I mean, you had a slide with an article about the Museum of the Bible, and this is like, I often say the past is now, and this is a real case where these issues of identity building, state making, and archaeology are really entangled in the moment, but also through time. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Oh, speaking of Morag, she has a question. Why do you think the work of Krause is overlooked in debate about the location of the site of her work basically paved the way for the excavation at Makatir?
So thank you so much, Morag, for this question. I loved Morag Kersel's talk about the Museum of the Bible in Washington, and I do feel very I feel that our themes are intertwined in many ways. I'm not really sure how to answer this excellent question, because throughout my research, I didn't go very deep into what her work really means about early Bronze Age archaeology. I thought more of the historic context of her work. So I don't feel like I'm an expert in answering why, but just sort of as a not so well thought of answer, I do feel there is a gender issue in how her legacy is perceived. So just to sort of follow up on what you're saying, for instance, it was Judith Krause-Marquet's intention to excavate at the site of Crossroad, and she saw the great promise of it. Because she died very, very young, unfortunately, she didn't get to follow through on that. But the letters between her family and the Hebrew University show a very, very troubled relationship. And the son of Sukenik was Igal Yadin, who later excavated in Chatzor, in an excavation that became the sort of field school for a generation of Israeli archaeologists to come. So in a way, it is sort of, we don't really think of her as such, but she was almost the great mother of Israeli biblical archaeology as it is today, but she never got the credit for that, I think. So what you're alluding to, I think, is part of that.
Thank you. So I have two questions. Okay, I have a question, and then I'll move on to a new question that just popped up in the chat. I was interested by this question of Jewish object. I know this is a big question, and also whenever you're in a classroom and these questions pop up, this is also something I think students are very interested in. And so it was fascinating for me to see this negotiation of objects being assigned according, because it's not the same criteria, right? One is Jewish, and the other, it's more it's cultural, but also chronological. So there is a certain dissonance between the two. So this question of Jewish object, of the Jewishness of an object, I understand was already very present at the time, right?
So it's really fascinating. In a way, it's even, I would say, therapeutic for some of us Israeli archaeologists to see these terms, to see these concerns being voiced so early on. It was really I was really surprised to see that Rothschild, before any archaeological find was ever unearthed, was very, very concerned and preoccupied with making sure that whatever archaeological finds are found, that they are separated from other finds. And I think you can see in Richmond's letter that there is this question of what does it mean? What does a Jewish archaeological find look like? And so Richmond is trying to give a narrow definition. So whatever archaeological finds that seem to have been used in Jewish cult or Jewish religion. So not the sense of this is a sort of a different approach than what we see now in places like the Museum of the Bible that Morag Carousel discussed, or in other museums. We see the sort of everyday life of biblical times. That's the sort of these are the finds that allow us to have those transcendental experiences. But Rothschild was really, I don't think he was well articulated in what he was looking for. And we see this in this sort of discomfort when early Bronze Age finds become these substitutes for Joshua. I think our question marks about what a Jewish artifact is are very much portrayed through the history of the exhibition.
This is why it's such a powerful case study. Thank you. Okay, I will let others ask questions. So Julian Hirsch is saying, thank you for your fascinating talk. Do you have plans for expanding your study of museum practice in British Mandate Palestine to other collections or exhibitions? Were such excavation by excavation exhibitions common? As in, was there an exhibition for Megiddo or for Lachish, for instance?
Thank you. I love this question. First I want to refer to the scholar that sort of, I think, paved the way for all of these archaeologists doubling as historians of archaeology in Israel, who is Raz Kleter, now in Helsinki, who wrote this wonderful book called Just Past ? That was published in 2006. And I think for me, it's a journey of discovery. So I am collecting these evidence of ephemeral or short-lived exhibitions, and I don't know enough about them. But I do know that the Jewish settlement had this tradition in the 1930s of including archaeological finds in what was known as the expos. So there was the Levant Expo, which was a huge annual exhibition in Tel Aviv, where all the new advances of the Jewish settlements were showcased. So this was anything from fashion to chemistry and also archaeology. So I tend to think of Judith Krause-Marquet's exhibition as part of that because of the context in Mikveh Israel. But I would be very interested to see other exhibitions of foreign international scholars working in Palestine at the time. So I'm also very interested in whether there were such exhibitions of Megiddo and Lachish.
Thank you. A question by Girish Daswani. Can you speak to ongoing archaeological biblical sites such as the excavations at the city of David, found in an occupied Palestinian neighborhood called Silwan? So he's referring to anthropologist Nadia Abu El-Hajj, who's argued that Israeli archaeology is part of a colonial apparatus, and he's talking about settler groups who lead tour and pilgrimage tours around the city of David, whose aim is to kind of recreate a certain version of biblical history. Do you have Any thoughts on that? I know it's a tricky issue.
I do have a lot of thoughts on that, and I'm grateful for you for making that connection. I'm not sure I feel absolutely free to sort of speak my mind completely, but I will say that at their current presentation, LIAT at the City of David, they mention Rothschild's role in excavating in the City of David as part of this genealogy of excavation in this site. So Rothschild's interest in the City of David are really in line with what is going now in Silouan. It's for me, it's a very similar approach. And for that reason, I was particularly struck to read Judith Krause-Marquet and Rothschild's attempt to legally take the land from the Muslim Palestinian owners. So that's, I was a bit struck by that because I didn't think of this as something that could happen and during the British Mandate. But it is very similar to what is now going on in the City of David, for sure.
What happened with this land in the longue durée? Did they expropriate it finally? Do we know whether it was sold or what happened?
I'm not really sure. What I'm sort of assuming is that because Rothschild passed away as these letters were being exchanged between Judith Krause-Marquet and the British officials, that this did not come to fruition. In the file, the archives file, there is no record of the land being expropriated or taken from the legal owners. But it's really striking to see, Rothschild thinking of that this land should be a historical park, or because it's so much in line with practices today.
It's true. I was also thinking of parallels with Egypt because these, I think these practices of biblical kind of motivated archaeology also encompass part of Egypt, right? So at the time, there aren't that many excavations in the Nile Delta, for instance, but a great deal of the sites on the eastern part of the Delta and towards the Red Sea were chiefly motivated by a wish to find biblical site. And so I think there's really, in what you were discussing, I could make a lot of links, not only with colonial archaeological practices of the time, but also with how these biblical motivation also were manifesting themselves beyond Palestine. This is another Egyptian connection.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I'm sort of highlighting one aspect of it, but really these were the early days of an emerging science of archaeology in the Middle East and in all its glory. I mean, there's certainly a lot of amazing things about the achievement of the excavation and the exhibition as paving the way for what to come. But it's also troubling to see the social and political mechanism that were so much embedded in those practices from such an early moment.
Yeah, I mean, you really see archaeology as a subjective somehow, right? Okay, so another question by Gregory Fuster. At one point, you identified a bit of a gap between the stories that the exhibitors wanted to tell and the artifacts that had been excavated from the site. Could they have simply used any artifacts? This strikes me as a perennial problem for historians and curators to confront. Is there anything about this particular story that you have found especially instructive or cautionary? And thanks for a fascinating. There's unanimity in that.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Gregory. I hope I'm understanding your question, because I think it's really important. You're asking if any artifacts could have been presented as evidence of the Bible, or am I misunderstanding you? Maybe you could clarify a bit. I'm sorry. I just want to get it right.
Okay, so I think he means this disconnect between them, the motivation to tell a particular story, but you don't necessarily have the evidence that would particularly fit. So you organize whatever you have in order to fit your narrative. So I think if I understand Greg correctly, this is what he means. So could they have basically picked any evidence and organize them in a way as to weave them in the narrative they want to tell?
So I feel that my reading of the exhibition has a bit of a caveat, because I don't have access to a catalog. So I'm basing on news reports and film footage. But what I'm seeing is these sort of two parallel ways of the exhibition being experienced by visitors as this Bible coming to life, very much like what Morag Kersel was showing with the Bible, the Museum of the Bible in Washington today, and certainly similar to other exhibitions that I grew up with in Israel. And for that sort of Bible coming to life, this sort of using everyday objects, material culture from very sort of diverse context, it seems like you could really use anything you want to evoke that feeling of, oh, this is biblical every day, or this is the land of the Bible, or the times of the Bible. This is the experience of a person living in the times of the Bible. What they did have, the archaeological finds that they did have from Judith Krause's excavations, are the biblical narrative. And I'm very curious if this was in any way acknowledged in the exhibition, because reporters, and there are many news reports about the exhibitions, but they say nothing about it. And there's also a report of scholars visiting the exhibition. So, for example, Albright took all of his colleagues to see the exhibition. And there's no mention of how the display of the objects is reflected in terms of the criticism that Judith Krause had. But surely this was part of the discussion, but I'm not seeing it in the reports of the exhibition.
Thank you. Yes, interesting. It's almost as if it's the exhibition as a product, or as a project in itself, right? So maybe we have time for one last question from Marika Sardar, who's saying, this is too far from my own field to comment, but I do see parallels to government-sponsored excavations in India intended to prove the antiquity of certain sites and the veracity of events in the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and other ancient Hindu texts. So thank you. And yeah, she had to leave, but hopefully she'll be able to see the answer in the recording. Yeah, do you have any thoughts or response to our comments?
Thank you, Malika. I feel like, yes, this is, to be fair, it is a practice that is much greater than, the Jewish and Arab contentions of the land. It's really part of the role of archaeology globally. Archaeology is always used to bring to life ancient narratives, or to form some sort of proof or disproof of presence on the land. And I think it's also present here in Canada in many ways. it's somehow a bit reassuring to see, for me, to see, no, this is not only a Middle Eastern issue, it's much, much broader than that. And yes, we should be mindful of these parallelisms, for sure.
Well, I think that conversations such as the one we're having right now will certainly help. And I can for sure see myself actually asking my students to watch your talk, and it's a great conversation starter for pedagogical purposes as well. So everyone who wants to turn on their camera now, if we can say a live thank you to our speaker, LIAT NAEH. Thanks everyone for showing up.
Thank you so much.
Great talk. And we're having our next one next Wednesday, actually. I'm also inviting my graduate students in the talk. So we'll have Professor Craig Williams, who will be back on Turtle Island. So he's going to talk about adopting an antiquity, native writers from North America on Greco-Roman antiquity. So you all have a good evening, night, wherever you are. And I see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.